The storm arrived without warning on that November night in 1858, howling across the Yorkshire coast like a living thing hungry for destruction. Eleanor Hartwell stood at the window of her tiny stone cottage, watching lightning split the black sky over the churning sea. Rain lashed against the glass with such force that she feared the old panes would shatter. The wind screamed through every crack in the ancient walls, making the single candle on her table flicker and dance shadows across the bare room. She should have been afraid. A widow alone in a cottage that leaked in 3 places, with barely enough coal to last the week and a roof that groaned with every gust. But Eleanor had learned something in her 24 years of life. Fear was a luxury for those who had something left to lose. She had buried her husband 2 winters past. Cholera had taken gentle Thomas Hartwell, the village carpenter, and left her with nothing but debts and a cottage too small to matter. The villagers of Whitby Cove had been kind at first, bringing soup and sympathy, but kindness fades when poverty lingers. Now they barely noticed her, the pale woman in the faded black dress who mended nets by the harbour for pennies and gathered driftwood along the shore. The storm intensified. Eleanor moved away from the window, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire in the hearth had died to embers. She couldn't afford to waste fuel, not with winter approaching, and her coin purse holding exactly 3 shillings and 4pence. Tomorrow she would walk to the harbour again, hoping the fishermen's wives had mending work. Tonight she would sleep in her clothes, and pray the roof held until morning. She was climbing into her narrow bed when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A crash, followed by something that might have been a shout, carried on the wind from somewhere near the cliffs. Eleanor paused, her hand on the thin blanket. It was probably nothing, a branch falling, or debris from the storm. No one would be out in this weather, no one sane. Anyway. But the sound came again, clearer this time. Definitely a voice, though the words were lost in the roar of wind and waves. Someone was out there in the darkness, and from the desperate tone, they were in terrible trouble. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She grabbed Thomas's old coat from its peg, far too large for her, but lined with wool that still held some warmth. She wrapped her shawl over her head, took the candle lantern, though it would do little good in the storm, and pushed open the cottage door. The wind nearly knocked her backward. Rain struck her face like ice needles, but Eleanor had grown up on these cliffs, the daughter of a lighthouse keeper before fever took both her parents. She knew every path, every dangerous edge, every place where the rocks turned treacherous. If someone was hurt out there, she might be the only one who could reach them. She followed the cliffs toward the sound, her lantern barely aglow against the blackness. The path was slick with rain and mud. Once she nearly lost her footing where the earth had washed away, catching herself on a jutting rock that tore her already worn gloves. Lightning flashed, and for a moment she saw the landscape in stark white relief. The churning sea below, the jagged rocks, the path ahead disappearing into shadow, and there, perhaps 50 yards ahead, something dark against the cliff face. Not a rock, too irregular. It moved slightly, and the leaning showed her what it was. A man, collapsed against a boulder, one arm hanging at a terrible angle. Blood darkened his face, though whether from his head or the rain mixing with a wound, she couldn't tell. His clothes, even soaked and muddied, looked expensive, fine wool, silver buttons catching the brief light. A gentleman then, lost or thrown from his horse, judging by the leather riding boots just visible beneath the mud. Eleanor reached him as another crash of thunder shook the cliffs. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Perhaps 30, with strong features beneath the blood and dirt. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. The injured arm was definitely broken, bent wrong at the elbow. A gash across his forehead bled freely, and when she touched his shoulder gently, trying to rouse him, he groaned but didn't wake. He was too heavy for her to carry, and the storm was getting worse. If she left him here to fetch help, he might die of cold or blood loss before she returned. If she tried to move him alone, she might kill him with her clumsiness or send them both over the cliff edge. Eleanor made her decision with the same practicality that had kept her alive through 2 years of widowed poverty. She would get him conscious enough to walk and somehow get him back to her cottage. It was that or watch him die. She knelt in the mud beside him, pulling off her soaked shawl to press against the head wound. With her other hand, she patted his face firmly, then harder. "Sir," she called over the wind. "Sir, you must wake up. I cannot carry you, and you cannot stay here." No response. She tried again. Louder, rougher. "Wake up, or you'll die on this cliff, and I'll not have another death on my conscience." Perhaps it was her sharp tone, or perhaps he was fighting his way back to consciousness anyway. His eyes fluttered, then opened. Even in the dim light of her nearly drowned lantern, she could see they were an unusual color, gray, like the storm clouds themselves. They focused on her with difficulty, confusion clouding his gaze. "Where?" he managed, his voice rough. "Are you an angel? Have I died?" "Then, you'll wish you'd died if you don't get up and move," Eleanor replied sharply, in no mood for delirium or poetry. "Can you stand?" He tried. She'd give him that. With her shoulder under his good arm, and grim determination on both their parts, they got him upright. He swayed dangerously, his face going white even in the darkness, but he stayed conscious. The walk back to the cottage took an eternity. Every step was a battle against the wind, the mud, his failing strength, and her own exhaustion. Twice he stumbled and nearly took them both down. Once he stopped entirely, overcome by pain or dizziness, and she had to slap his face and tell him in the plainest terms that she would not die with him on this cliff, so he had better keep moving. When they finally reached her cottage and she managed to push open the door, they nearly fell through together in a tangle of wet limbs and gasping breaths. Eleanor kicked the door shut against the storm and stood for a moment in the sudden relative quiet, her heart pounding, her body shaking with cold and effort. The stranger had passed out again, his weight nearly pulling her down. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she half dragged, half carried him to her small bed, the only bed, and laid him upon it. Then she stood back, dripping water onto her own floor, and looked at what she'd done. A strange man, clearly a gentleman from his fine clothes, bleeding on her only mattress. His broken arm needed setting, his wounds needed cleaning. He needed warmth, dry clothes, possibly a doctor, though God knew how she'd pay for one. And she needed to explain to absolutely no one why she'd brought an injured man into her home, because no one in Whitby Cove would believe anything innocent about a widow alone with a gentleman overnight. But Eleanor had stopped caring what people believed about her somewhere around the time she'd sold her mother's silver tea set to pay for Thomas's burial. She had saved a life tonight. That was enough. She went to work with the efficiency of necessity. Her cottage might be poor, but it was clean, and she knew the basics of nursing from tending her dying husband. She built up the fire, using more coal than she should, but needing the heat. She boiled water in her single kettle. She tore strips from an old petticoat for bandages, since she had no cloth to spare. She cut away his ruined shirt with her sewing scissors, revealing a chest marked with bruises from what must have been a terrible fall. The head wound was the worst. It had stopped bleeding, but would need stitching. Eleanor had sewn torn flesh before, on fishermen brought up from the harbour, though never on someone unconscious who might wake and thrash. She threaded her finest needle with steady hands and did what needed doing, her small precise stitches closing the gash as neatly as any doctor's. He groaned, but didn't wake. The broken arm was beyond her skill. She could splint it to keep it stable until morning, but it needed a doctor's setting. She bound it carefully with torn petticoat strips and 2 pieces of kindling wood, then covered him with her only blanket and Thomas's old coat on top of that. By the time she finished, dawn was breaking. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie calm. Eleanor sat on the floor by the fire, her wet clothes steaming, too exhausted to move. She looked at the man in her bed. In sleep, with the dirt and blood cleaned away, she could see he was handsome in that aristocratic way, all sharp bones and fine features. His dark hair, dried now, fell across his forehead where she had stitched him. His hands, she noticed, were surprisingly calloused for a gentleman. A rider's hands, scarred across the knuckles. He stirred slightly, murmuring something that sounded like a name. Catherine, or Caroline. A wife, perhaps, someone who would be frantic with worry. Eleanor closed her eyes. She should go into the village, report that she'd found an injured gentleman, let the constable handle it. But if she did, they would take him away to the doctor's house or the inn, and no one would ever remember that Eleanor Hartwell had saved his life. She would go back to being invisible. The poor widow who didn't matter, and perhaps more importantly, she would never know who he was, this stranger who had looked at her in his delirium and asked if she was an angel. She let herself have one moment of foolish vanity. Then she pulled herself to her feet, put on dry clothes, and went to fetch the doctor. The village of Whitby Cove woke slowly to the aftermath of the storm. Debris littered the streets. Roof tiles lay shattered in the mud. The harbour was a mess of damaged boats and tangled nets. But Eleanor barely noticed as she hurried to Dr. Morrison's house on the better side of the village, where the merchants and shopkeepers lived in their neat stone houses with painted shutters. Dr. Morrison was a practical man in his 50s who had delivered half the village and buried the other half. He opened his door in his dressing gown, took one look at Eleanor's face and asked, "Who's hurt?" "A gentleman," Eleanor said quickly. "I found him on the cliffs during the storm. He's at my cottage. A broken arm and a head wound. I've cleaned and stitched the head injury, but the arm needs proper setting." The doctor's bushy eyebrows rose. "You brought a strange man to your cottage. Alone? Would you have preferred I leave him to die on the cliffs?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. He was bleeding and unconscious. There wasn't time for propriety, Dr. Morrison. To his credit, the doctor merely grunted and reached for his coat. "Let me fetch my bag. The village will have your name through every mouth by dinner time, you know. The village already talks about me. At least now they'll have something interesting to say." They walked back to the cottage in the strengthening light. Dr. Morrison asked practical questions. How long had he been unconscious? What color was the blood from his head? How had she moved him? Eleanor answered with equal practicality, and by the time they reached her door, the doctor was looking at her with something approaching respect. The stranger was awake. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed when she stepped through the door. He was sitting up in her bed, looking around the tiny cottage with obvious confusion. When the door opened and Eleanor entered with the doctor behind her, those storm-grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You," he said, his voice rough but stronger than last night. "You're real. I thought perhaps I'd dreamed you." "I'm quite real," Eleanor replied, suddenly self-conscious about her patched dress and the cottage's poverty now that he could see it in daylight. "This is Dr. Morrison. He's come to set your arm." "My arm?" The stranger looked down as if just noticing his injury. "Ah, yes. That would explain the rather extraordinary pain." He looked back at Eleanor. "You saved my life. I pulled you off a cliff. The doctor will save your life if that arm sets wrong and festers." Dr. Morrison moved forward. All business. Let's have a look then. What's your name, sir? The stranger hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. William, he said. William Shaw. Eleanor noticed the hesitation but said nothing. She watched as the doctor examined the injury, noting the way William Shaw, if that was truly his name, bore the pain of the examination with gritted teeth and white knuckles, but no complaint. It's a clean break, Dr. Morrison announced, painful, but not complicated. I'll set it now. Mrs. Hartwell, I'll need your assistance. The setting was brutal. Eleanor held William Shaw down, while the doctor pulled and manipulated the broken bone back into place. William made a sound like a wounded animal, but didn't struggle. Sweat poured down his face. When it was done and the arm was properly splintered, he lay back against her thin pillow, breathing hard. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," said quietly, offering him water from her only cup. "That pain you're feeling means you're alive." He drank gratefully, then managed a weak smile. "And grateful for it, though I'm not certain my arm agrees." His eyes found hers again. "How long was I out there before you found me?" "I don't know. I heard you during the height of the storm. Around midnight, perhaps. You'd lost blood and were half frozen, and you came alone into a storm to fetch a stranger." Something in his voice made it more than a question. There was no one else to do it. Eleanor took back the cup, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. "Rest now. The doctor says you must stay still for at least 3 days, until we're certain there's no fever from the head wound." 3 days? William Shaw looked around the tiny cottage with new awareness. At the single bed he occupied, at the obvious poverty of his surroundings. "Madam, I cannot impose upon your hospitality for 3 days. You've done more than enough. If you'll send word to the inn, I'm certain arrangements can be made. The inn is a mile away, and you're in no condition to be moved." Dr. Morrison interjected. "Mrs. Hartwell is right. You need rest and observation. Any fever from that head wound could be dangerous." But surely, William Shaw looked between them, clearly struggling with the impropriety. "It isn't proper for Mrs. Hartwell to house a strange man alone." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. "Dr. Morrison will inform the constable of the situation, and I promise you, Mr. Shaw, your virtue is quite safe with me. I have a pallet I can make up by the fire. You'll keep the bed, since you can't easily move. We'll observe all proprieties possible under the circumstances." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, perhaps, or admiration. "Then I am in your debt, Mrs. Hartwell, and deeply grateful." When the doctor left, promising to return in the evening to check for fever, Eleanor found herself alone with the stranger in her bed. An awkward silence fell. William Shaw studied her cottage with those keen grey eyes, taking in the patched curtains, the bare shelves, the lack of any decoration or comfort beyond the absolute necessities. Eleanor busied herself with tidying what little there was to tidy, painfully aware of what he must be thinking, that he'd been rescued by a woman with nothing, saved by someone who could barely save herself. "You're wondering about my circumstances," she said finally, unable to bear the silence. "I'm a widow. My husband died 2 years ago. I get by with mending work and what small jobs I can find." "I'm wondering," William Shaw said slowly, "what kind of extraordinary woman risks her life in a storm to save a complete stranger, nurses his wounds with skill that rivals many doctors I've known, and then apologizes for the poverty of the shelter she's offered." Eleanor paused in her tidying, surprised by the warmth in his voice. Any decent person would have done the same. Would they? He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. "I've known many people, Mrs. Hartwell. Most would have left me on that cliff, especially once they saw I had nothing to immediately offer in return." "You're a gentleman," Eleanor pointed out, "clearly a man of means, judging by your clothes. Anyone would expect compensation for saving you." Is that why you saved me? For compensation? His voice held genuine curiosity, not accusation. No. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I saved you because you needed saving, and I was there to do it. But I'll not pretend your money wouldn't be welcome, Mr. Shaw. I'm poor, not proud. If you wish to pay me for my trouble once you're recovered, I'll take it gratefully. Lord knows I need it. He laughed, then immediately regretted it as the movement jarred his arm. By God, you're honest. That's rarer than you might think in my circles. Your circles? He paused again, that same slight hesitation. I'm in commerce. Import and export. I was riding to meet business associates in Whitby when the storm caught me. My horse must have panicked. I remember being thrown, hitting my head, and then darkness until you appeared. Like he smiled slightly. Well, like an angel in the storm. Eleanor didn't believe him. She didn't know why, exactly. Maybe it was that fractional pause before he spoke. Maybe it was the calluses on his hands that didn't quite match a merchant's work. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, even injured, with an authority that spoke of more than commerce. But she said nothing. If William Shaw wanted to lie about who he was, that was his business. She would care for him until he was well enough to leave, take whatever payment he offered, and return to her quiet, poor, invisible life. Except it didn't work out that way. 3 days of caring for an injured man in a one-room cottage is an intimacy that breaks down barriers faster than propriety can build them. Eleanor learned that William Shaw was educated far beyond what most merchants required. He spoke French fluently and could quote Latin poetry. He knew politics and history with the kind of detailed understanding that came from being close to power. He had traveled widely, spoke of India and Egypt and Constantinople with the casual authority of someone who had actually been to those distant places. And he watched her, constantly, with those grey eyes that seemed to see far more than she wanted to reveal. He watched her mend fishing nets with small, precise stitches, watched her cook their meager meals, turning nothing into something that could at least fill a stomach. Watched her read aloud to him in the evenings from the single book she owned, a volume of poetry that had been her mother's. One evening, the third night, as she sat by the fire reading while he rested, he suddenly said, "Where did you learn to read like that?" Eleanor looked up from the page. "My father was a lighthouse keeper. He believed in education, even for daughters. He taught me to read and write and do figures. And your husband?" Thomas was a carpenter, a good man, gentle and kind. Her voice softened. "He never minded that I could read better than he could. He said I had enough learning for both of us. You loved him. It wasn't a question. I did. Not the wild, passionate love of novels, perhaps, but he was good to me, and I grieved deeply when he died." She closed the book. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm trying to understand how a woman of obvious intelligence and capability ends up alone in a cottage, barely fit for habitation, mending nets for pennies." His voice held something that might have been anger, but not at her. "You should have family, protection, help." "Should is a pleasant word that means nothing," Eleanor replied quietly. "I have no family. Thomas's family blamed me for his death. Said I should have nursed him better. My own parents are long dead. The village is kind enough in its way, but kindness doesn't pay rent or buy coal. I do what I must to survive, Mr. Shaw. That's all any of us can do. What if you had choices?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent on her face. "What would you do if circumstances were different?" Eleanor hesitated, surprised by the question. No one had asked her what she wanted in so long that she'd almost forgotten she could want anything beyond basic survival. "I suppose," she said slowly, I'd want a place that was truly mine, not this cottage that the landlord could take back any time the rent's late. Somewhere I could grow herbs and vegetables, maybe keep chickens. I'd want enough work to keep me busy and enough money that I didn't lie awake every night calculating whether I can afford both bread and coal. She smiled slightly. Simple things, nothing grand, and if you could have grand things, I wouldn't know what to do with them, Eleanor answered, honestly. I'm not made for grandness, Mr. Shaw. I'm made for survival, and I've gotten rather good at it. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. I think you're made for far more than you know, Eleanor Hartwell. The use of her Christian name startled her, but before she could protest the familiarity, he had closed his eyes, exhausted by even that small conversation. Eleanor sat watching him sleep, the book forgotten in her lap. She knew somehow that when he left, and he would leave soon, his arm was healing well, something would change. She just didn't know what. On the morning of the fourth day, William Shaw was strong enough to stand and walk around the cottage, though Dr. Morrison still insisted he needed another few days of rest before attempting to travel. Eleanor was at the harbour, delivering finished mending and hoping for new work, when the elegant carriage arrived in Whitby Cove. It caused an immediate sensation. Carriages like that, black lacquered with a crest on the door, didn't come to places like Whitby Cove. The 4 horses were obviously thoroughbreds, their coats gleaming. The driver and footman wore livery. Half the village gathered to gawk as the carriage stopped in front of Eleanor's cottage. She heard about it from Mrs. Cooper at the chandler's shop before she'd even finished her morning errands. Rushed straight to your cottage, they did, Mrs. Cooper reported with ill-concealed excitement. Important-looking gentleman stepped out, demanded to know where the injured man was being kept. Dr. Morrison took him right in. Who is he, Eleanor? This Mr. Shaw you've been hiding. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She'd known William Shaw was lying about being a simple merchant, but a carriage with a crest meant something far more significant than she'd imagined. I don't know, she answered, honestly. He never said, and I never asked. She hurried back to her cottage, dread and curiosity warring in her chest. She could hear voices before she even reached the door. One was William Shaw's, raised in what sounded like anger. The other was unfamiliar, male, speaking in the clipped tones of extreme education and authority. She pushed open the door to find her tiny cottage crowded with people. Dr. Morrison stood pressed against one wall. William Shaw, dressed now in clothes that must have been brought from the carriage, fine wool and tailored perfection, stood by her bed. And near the fire stood a man of perhaps 50, silver-haired and stern-faced, looking at Eleanor's poverty-stricken cottage with barely concealed horror. Mrs. Hartwell, Dr. Morrison said quickly, this is Lord Edmund Crawford, the Earl of Ashford. He's been searching for Mr. Shaw. Earl. The word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She looked at William Shaw, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. Actually, the Earl said, his cold gaze fixing on Eleanor with what she suspected was profound disapproval. He is the Honourable William Crawford, my nephew and heir to the Ashford title and estates. Heir to an earldom. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She'd been housing not just a gentleman, but nobility. She'd cut away his shirt and stitched his head and seen him at his most vulnerable. She'd spoken to him with the plain honesty of an equal, never guessing the vast gulf of rank between them. I see, she managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Lord William, I apologize. If I had known, I would have. Would have what? William. Lord William. Stepped toward her. Left me to die on the cliffs. Treated me differently. That's precisely why I didn't tell you, Mrs. Hartwell. You lied to me? The words came out more sharply than she intended. I told you my circumstances honestly. You let me believe you were a merchant. You let me treat you as an equal when you knew perfectly well the impossibility of such a thing. Eleanor, he began, but his uncle interrupted. Mrs. Hartwell, the Earl said, each word dripping with aristocratic disdain. I'm sure my nephew is appropriately grateful for your assistance. I've instructed my secretary to arrange a suitable reward for your trouble. He drew out a purse heavy with coin and set it on Eleanor's table as if touching the furniture might soil his gloves. That should more than compensate you for any expenses incurred. Eleanor looked at the purse. There was probably more money there than she'd see in 5 years of mending nets. It would solve every problem she had. Pay off her debts, buy coal for the winter, perhaps even let her leave Whitby Cove and start fresh somewhere else. It was exactly what she'd told William Shaw she wanted. Compensation for her trouble, and it felt like being slapped. No thank you, she heard herself say. I didn't save Lord William's life for money. Don't be foolish, the Earl said sharply. You're clearly in desperate need. Take the money. I said no. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting the Earl's contemptuous gaze. Lord William will need continued care for his arm. Dr. Morrison can arrange that elsewhere. I would like you all to leave my cottage now. Eleanor, please. William Shaw. Lord William Crawford moved toward her, but Eleanor stepped back. You've been very kind, Lord William. I'm glad you're recovering well. But our association is ended. Please go. I won't leave like this, William said firmly, not with you looking at me as if I've betrayed you. Haven't you? Eleanor's eyes stung, but she refused to cry in front of these men. I told you everything about myself, my poverty, my struggles, my dead husband, my circumstances. I was honest to the point of humiliation, and you lied with every breath. You let me call you Mr. Shaw. You let me treat you as my equal when you're so far above me that even speaking to you directly is probably improper. So yes, Lord William, I feel betrayed. My name is William, he said quietly. That at least was true. And I didn't lie about the important things. I didn't lie when I said you were extraordinary. I didn't lie when I said you deserved far more than this. He gestured at the cottage. And I'm not lying now when I tell you that meeting you, being cared for by you, has changed something in me that I can't quite name. William, his uncle said warningly. Enough. We must return to London immediately. Your father is frantic, and Lady Caroline is beside herself. Lady Caroline, the name he'd murmured in his delirium. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. Your wife? She asked quietly. My betrothed, William answered, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. An arrangement made when we were children. She's a lovely girl from an appropriate family. We're to be married in the spring. Of course he was betrothed. Of course there was a Lady Caroline, beautiful and appropriate and everything Eleanor would never be. The fairy tale she hadn't even realized she'd been spinning in her mind shattered completely. Then you should go to her, Eleanor said, proud that her voice remained steady. I'm sure she's been very worried. Thank you for the offer of compensation, Lord William, but I don't require it. I did what anyone would have done. That's not true, and you know it. William's voice held frustration and something else Eleanor couldn't identify. Eleanor, please, don't send me away like this. Your name is Mrs. Hartwell, Eleanor corrected gently. And you're not being sent away, Lord William. You're returning to where you belong. To your family, your betrothed, your life. A life that has nothing to do with a poor widow in a cottage in Whitby Cove. The Earl made an impatient sound. William, we're leaving. Now. For a moment, Eleanor thought William might refuse. He stood looking at her with an intensity that made her want to step forward and step back simultaneously. Then, slowly, he nodded. Very well. He moved to the table, picked up the heavy purse his uncle had left, and held it out to Eleanor. I know you said you don't want it, but please, take this, not as payment but as a gift. Let me do this one thing for you. Eleanor looked at the purse. Pride warred with practicality. Pride said, refuse it. Send him away with nothing to remember her, but the knowledge that she'd wanted nothing from him. Practicality said, take it. You fool, winter is coming, and pride doesn't keep you warm. She reached out and took the purse. It was surprisingly heavy. Thank you, she said quietly. I hope your arm heals well, Lord William. Something that might have been pain crossed his face. Goodbye, Eleanor Hartwell, he said. I don't think I'll forget you. Then he was gone, following his uncle out to the carriage. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the elegant equipage pull away, taking William Crawford back to his life of earldoms and estates and appropriate brides. The village had gathered to watch, whispering behind their hands. Let them whisper, Eleanor thought. She'd saved a lord's life. That was something, even if it was something that was now over. She closed the door and looked down at the purse in her hands. When she opened it, she nearly dropped it in shock. It wasn't just coins, there were banknotes. More money than she'd ever seen in her life. Enough to not just survive the winter, but to survive 4 years. To buy the cottage outright, maybe. To start over somewhere else. To choose for the first time in her life what came next. She sat down heavily on the bed William had occupied, the bed she'd given up for a stranger, and finally let herself cry. Not for the loss of something she'd never really had, but for the strange, impossible, brief connection she'd felt with a man named William Shaw, who had turned out to be Lord William Crawford, heir to an earldom, and so far beyond her reach that even her tears for him felt presumptuous. 7 years passed. Eleanor used the money from William Crawford to buy her cottage outright from the landlord and to invest in a small business. She'd learnt mending and sewing from necessity. Now she turned those skills into a trade, taking in work from the better families in the surrounding towns, doing fine embroidery and detailed alterations that commanded good prices. She would never be wealthy, but she was no longer poor. She was comfortable, independent, and if she was sometimes lonely in her tidy cottage with its herb garden and 3 chickens, well, that was the price of independence. She heard news of Lord William occasionally, passed down through the chains of gossip that connected even remote Yorkshire villages to London society. He had married Lady Caroline in a grand ceremony at St. George's. He had become Viscount Crawford when his grandfather had died, bringing him 1 step closer to the earldom. He had 2 sons and a daughter. He had never returned to Yorkshire. Eleanor told herself she didn't care. The few days with William Shaw had been an aberration, a strange moment outside her real life. She had a good life now, a quiet life, and she was content. Then, on a bright October morning in 1865, 7 years almost to the day after the storm that had changed everything, a carriage arrived in Whitby Cove. It was autumn again, the air crisp with approaching winter, and Eleanor was in her garden cutting the last of the herbs when she heard the commotion from the village. She looked up to see an elegant black carriage making its way up the lane toward her cottage. Her heart, which had learned to be sensible over the years, suddenly began beating faster. It couldn't be. It was probably some lady with embroidery work, nothing more. But as the carriage drew closer, she saw the crest on the door. The same crest she'd seen 7 years ago, the Ashford crest. And when the door opened and a man stepped down, Eleanor's carefully ordered world tilted. William Crawford, no longer injured, no longer young, looked at her across the garden. He was older, of course. His face had harder lines now, and there were threads of silver in his dark hair. But those eyes, storm grey and intense, were exactly the same. Eleanor Hartwell, he said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. I've come to ask you a question I should have asked 7 years ago. Eleanor stood frozen, herbs forgotten in her hands, as the man she had saved and sent away walked toward her. Lord William, she managed, I heard you married. That you have children. What question could you possibly have for me? He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the weariness in his face, the weight he carried. The question is this, Eleanor. When I left you 7 years ago, I did the proper thing, the expected thing. I went back to my life, married the appropriate bride, fulfilled my duties, but I've spent every single day of those 7 years wondering what would have happened if I'd done the improper thing instead. If I'd asked you to come with me, if I'd fought for what I wanted rather than what was expected. So I'm here now, 7 years late, to ask what I should have asked then. He took a breath. Eleanor Hartwell, would you have married me if I'd asked? If I'd been brave enough to choose my own heart over my family's expectations? The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor's mind spun. She was married. This conversation was not just improper. It was impossible. Lord William, she said carefully, you can't ask me that. You have a wife, children, a life. I had a wife, William said quietly. Lady Caroline died 18 months ago. Complications from childbirth. She was... He paused. She was a good woman. I cared for her deeply, and I grieved her truly. But Eleanor, I never loved her the way I should have. Because my heart never left this cottage. It never stopped belonging to the woman who saved my life and asked nothing in return. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. You can't say these things. You don't know me. We spent 3 days together 7 years ago. I'm not the woman you've built up in your memory, William. I'm just Eleanor Hartwell, a widow who mends clothes and grows herbs. You've romanticized something that was never real. Then let me know you now, William said. He moved closer, his voice urgent. I've spent 7 years being the perfect heir, the perfect husband, the perfect father. I've done everything that was expected of me. Caroline's death released me from my marriage, and I've honored her memory for the proper mourning period. But I can't, I won't, spend the rest of my life wondering what if. So I'm here, Eleanor, not as Lord William Crawford, but as the man you pulled off a cliff, the man you saved, the man who has loved you from the moment you told him to stop dying and start moving. Loved me? Eleanor's voice cracked. You don't love me. You love the idea of me. The notion of the simple woman who wasn't impressed by your title. I love the woman who was honest enough to tell me she needed money, practical enough to save my life, and strong enough to send me away when I was too cowardly to ask her to stay. William reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished. She didn't. His hand, still bearing the calluses of a man who did more than sit in drawing rooms, cupped her cheek gently. I love you, Eleanor Hartwell. I've loved you for 7 years. I'll love you for the next 50 if you'll let me. Your family will never accept me, Eleanor whispered. Your children, my children, need a mother who is genuine and strong, not someone who will teach them that appearances matter more than character. My father, the Earl, may bluster, but he cannot disinherit me. I'm the only heir, and Eleanor, his thumb brushed across her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I don't care if they accept you. I only care if you'll accept me. Second chance, 7 years late. Not perfect, but real. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of the girl she'd been, pulling a stranger off a cliff. She thought of the woman she'd become, building a life from nothing. She thought of all the nights she'd lain awake, remembering a man who'd called her extraordinary, and wondering if she'd been a fool to send him away. Why now? She asked, her eyes still closed. Why come back after 7 years? Because I'm finally free to do what I should have done then, William said simply. And because I'd promised myself that if I could just get through the mourning period with honor, if I could just be patient enough to do right by Caroline's memory, then I would come here and see if perhaps, Maybe, by some miracle, you might still be unmarried, still here, still Eleanor. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at him. Really looked past the title, past the wealth, past the 7 years of separation. She saw a man who had kept her in his heart while he kept his promises to another woman. A man who had honored his duties but never forgotten his heart's choice. A man who had come back, knowing she might refuse him, knowing she might have moved on, but coming anyway because some things were worth the risk. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "my life will change completely. I'll have to leave this cottage, this village. I'll be Lady Crawford eventually, expected to host parties and manage great houses and be someone I've never been." "If you say yes," William countered, "you'll have a home that's truly yours, gardens larger than you've ever imagined, security you've never known. But more than that, Eleanor, you'll have me, every day for the rest of our lives. I'll wake up grateful that you said yes. I'll never forget that you saved me twice, once from a cliff, and once from a life without love." The choice hung before her, safety in the familiar or risk in the unknown, the quiet life she'd built, or the impossible chance at something more. Eleanor thought of the girl who had walked into a storm to save a stranger. That girl hadn't been cautious. That girl had been brave. "Ask me properly," Eleanor said softly. "If you want me to answer, ask me properly. William Crawford." William smiled, that same smile she remembered from 7 years ago, the one that transformed his face from austere to radiant. Slowly, carefully, mindful of his once broken arm, he lowered himself to one knee in her herb garden. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, looking up at her with eyes that held 7 years of longing and hope, "will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a man who was too blind to see what mattered 7 years ago, but who has spent every day since learning to see clearly? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you are, and always have been, the most extraordinary woman I have ever known?" Eleanor looked down at him, this lord on his knees in her garden, and made her choice. "Yes," she said, and watched as joy transformed his face. "Yes, I'll marry you, William Crawford. I'll take the risk. I'll leave my cottage and my quiet life. I'll learn to be Lady Crawford and host parties and do whatever else is required. But not because you're a viscount or because you have wealth or position." She reached down and cupped his face in her work-roughened hands. "I'll marry you because 7 years ago, for 3 days, I knew a man named William Shaw who made me feel less alone, and I've been less alone ever since, because he stayed in my heart even when he left my cottage." William rose, pulling her into his arms with a care that spoke of 7 years of restraint, finally released. "I love you," he said against her hair. "God, Eleanor, I love you so much." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered back, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. She had loved him from those 3 days, loved him through 7 years of his absence, loved him enough to let him go, and now, improbably, impossibly, she was being given the chance to love him for the rest of their lives. The village, of course, exploded with gossip when Lord Viscount Crawford announced his intention to marry the widow Hartwell. Lady Beatrice Cooper, who had been spreading spiteful rumors about Eleanor for 7 years, nearly fainted. Dr. Morrison attended the wedding and later claimed he'd known from the first day that something special had happened in Eleanor's cottage. The Earl of Ashford did indeed bluster and object, but as William had predicted, he couldn't disinherit his only heir. Eventually, after meeting Eleanor and seeing how his grandchildren bloomed under her genuine affection, even the Earl was forced to admit that his son had chosen well, if unconventionally. Eleanor became Lady Crawford, and eventually Countess of Ashford. She learned to manage great houses and host grand parties. She never quite lost her plain way of speaking, and London society found her refreshingly honest, if a bit odd. She transformed the Ashford Estate's gardens into showcases of herbs and practical plants alongside the ornamental flowers, scandalized the housekeeper by insisting on teaching the maids to read, and became known for her charity to widows and other women in circumstances she remembered all too well. But on storm nights, when wind howled around the great stone walls of Ashford Hall, Eleanor and William would sometimes stand at the window together, watching lightning crack the sky, and William would put his arm around her, the arm she'd set 7 years before, and pull her close. "What are you thinking?" he'd ask, and Eleanor would smile and answer, "I'm thinking about the night I saved a stranger's life, and how he gave me mine in return." If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and let us know which moment struck you most. Your support helps us bring more timeless Victorian love stories to life. Subscribe to our channel to continue this journey through courage, patience, and love that defies time itself. Stay until the end. Another romantic tale awaits to sweep you into the past, where true love always finds a way home.